Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking a necessary but a really difficult mission. We're going to peel back the layers of myth that surround the Vikings. For centuries, we've had this image.
The fearless explorer, the noble warrior.
Exactly, the master shipbuilder. But our mission today is to look past all that, past the romanticized sagas, and confront the brutal, detailed reality of their economic foundation.
And it's so essential that we do. Our sources for this deep dive are their historical chroniclers, their archaeological records, and some of the earliest Scandinavian legal texts.
And they all paint a very consistent picture.
They do, a very specific one. We're analyzing the true legacy of the Vikings through the lens of their systematic, industrial-scale human trafficking operation.
And that's the key word right there, isn't it? Systematic. This wasn't just a side effect of raiding.
Not at all. This was the business model. It was highly profitable, meticulously organized, and it generated the immense wealth they needed to sustain that expansion we're all so familiar with.
So our specific focus today is to analyze the fate of the women captured during these raids, specifically the wives and daughters of the defeated.
Yeah. The historical accounts we've synthesized, they describe their destiny in this really chilling way.
Worse than death.
Worse than death. And our goal is to unpack exactly how the system was organized from the very moment of capture.
Through the transportation, which is standardized.
All the way to the sophisticated legal codes that formalize their non-existence as human beings. It's a complete pipeline.
So the central argument, what the evidence is really showing us, is that this was highly organized commerce.
Absolutely. The complexity of the logistics, the documentation, it all proves it. This was a sophisticated industry. It generated capital. It funded shipbuilding. It dictated the entire social structure of Viking settlements.
So they took something that was, I guess, opportunistic violence.
And they refined it.
Yeah.
They refined it into a model of highly efficient, systematic terror. And that distinction, commerce over chaos, is absolutely vital to understanding the full scope of this tragedy.
Okay, so let's unpack that first stage, the aftermath of a raid. We always focus on the battles, the drama of the fighting.
Right.
But the sources, they make it really clear that the violence of the battle itself was, in a way, temporary. The true systematic cruelty began the moment the swords were sheathed.
That's a profound insight from the texts. Those who fell in battle, they received, and I'm quoting here, the mercy of a quick death. Their suffering was over in that moment.
But for those left behind?
For those left behind, the process that began next was not spontaneous. It was systematic terror refined over centuries. It was explicitly designed not just to subdue, but to erase identity.
To transform a human being into a tradable asset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The end goal was pure commodification.
The sources describe the Viking raiders, once the fighting stopped, moving through the settlements. And the description is with the efficiency of wolves.
And their first action wasn't grabbing silver or treasure.
No, it was organizing the survivors. This is what you call the cruel efficiency of selection.
Precisely. The selection was methodical, not random. They separated the captured population like livestock.
That phrase is just chilling.
It is. Men were moved aside, usually executed on the spot if they weren't suitable for heavy labor or, a high-value ransom.
And the women.
Women were moved to a different staging area, and the children were often scattered, which was part of the psychological breakdown. This immediate sorting process was the critical first stage of inventory management.
And the criteria for who lived and who died were brutally practical. It was all driven by market economics.
Completely. If you were deemed too old, too sick, or too young to work or breed, you were often killed right then and there.
Because you were commercially worthless.
You were a liability. If a person couldn't be sold or immediately used, they were just a mouth to feed on the journey back. It strips away any illusion of morality. This wasn't about vengeance or rage.
It's about efficiency.
Pure efficiency. The marked commodity, the highest priority target, were women of fighting and, crucially, reproductive age.
The sources are very explicit that young mothers were highly sought after. Why was that?
Well, for two reasons. First, their fertility was proven. That's a huge selling point. But second, and maybe more cynically, having their children with them made their desperation and therefore their compliance complete.
They had something to lose, something to protect.
Which made them easier to control over long, brutal distances. So these women, in that moment, are on the cusp of becoming thralls.
The Norse term for slaves.
Right. And it was an immediate transition. The system was designed to consume their identities, their bodies, and their souls, turning them into property under a legal and social system that offered zero recourse.
And that transformation began instantly, which moves us to what the sources call the inventory begins.
Which was, above all else, intense psychological warfare applied in a very practical way.
The descriptions of this initial examination they're harrowing. The Viking officers, the sources say, were not just soldiers, they were experienced in human trafficking.
They were assessors, capable of evaluating human merchandise on the spot.
So what were they actually looking for during this commercial assessment?
They needed to establish a value proposition for each individual. It was a physical examination, very thorough, conducted by experts in the trade. They'd check teeth.
Not for hygiene, I assume.
No, for strength, and as an indicator of age. It was a clear sign of labor potential. They'd examine limbs for fitness, for capacity, for sustained work, and very notably, faces were scrutinized for beauty.
Because that commanded a higher price.
A significantly higher price, especially in the big international markets like Constantinople or Baghdad. They were applying the same rigorous standards you would to a prize warhorse or, hunting dogs.
And the humiliation of this process, the sheer deliberateness of it, served a dual purpose. It wasn't just assessment.
No, it was psychological destruction.
These examinations were conducted in full public view, often right in front of surviving family members.
Children watching their mothers being prodded and evaluated for physical strength and sexual appeal. Husbands or fathers, if they were still alive, forced to witness this.
That kind of terror leaves a scar far deeper than any physical injury. It was an intentional strategy. Break the spirit of the individual and destroy the communal bonds of the captured group right from the start. The message was inescapable. Your dignity, your identity, your family, all of it is irrelevant now. Your value is purely physical, purely commercial.
And reinforcing this transformation was the obsessive documentation that followed.
The ledgers. This is what really separates this from just opportunistic looting. This is what makes it an industry. Scribes, right there on the battlefield, recorded every minute detail. Age, original location, any potential skills they could identify, and an estimated market value.
And an estimated market value for each person. These weren't just simple tally marks. We're talking about detailed records. These ledgers filled the ship holds right alongside the silver and furs.
It's just incredible, the level of bureaucracy.
The documentation ensured accountability. It reduced fraud during later transactions, and ultimately it optimized profit. This bureaucratic layer confirms the industrial scale of the whole operation.
So the woman's original name was immediately forgotten.
Erased. She received a designation, an inventory code, a number that would track her from the moment of capture to her final sale.
She ceased to be a person. She became merchandise.
And that erasure is the true beginning of the horror. The documentation acted as the legal mechanism of identity deletion. It made it official. The paper trail confirms that for the Vikings, this wasn't violence, it was accounting. So once that inventory was complete, the logistical challenge began, moving thousands of people, often across vast hostile distances. This brings us to Section 2, the logistics of misery.
Right. And the journey to the harbors itself was a tool of subjection. The sources detail a truly nightmarish reality.
The women were chained together in columns.
Columns that could number in the hundreds, forced to march across brutal terrain, sometimes for weeks or even months, all heading toward these strategic coastal trading hubs.
Places like Hedeby or Dublin.
Exactly. And the restraints they used were specialized. These weren't crude, improvised tools. You mentioned the chains were described as works of craftsmanship designed specifically for human transport. How detailed are the archaeological findings on this?
They're quite specific, and they confirm this industrial specialization. At sites like Burka and Hedeby, we found iron collars and chain links that show a uniformity of design.
So this wasn't just a local blacksmith making one or two.
No, these were workshops mass-producing shackles. The iron collars were designed to be robust, impossible to remove but for the high-value cargo.
The more beautiful or younger women?
They were often fitted with leather or even felt padding. Not for comfort, but to prevent serious chafing that would decrease their market value.
It's loss prevention.
It's purely loss prevention. The links connecting them were perfectly calibrated. They allowed just enough movement for the women to march, but not enough for any coordinated escape attempt or a physical attack on the guards.
That level of refinement, designing restraint systems for efficiency, it just speaks volumes about how mature this industry was.
Absolutely. And the Viking guards managing these caravans were not just soldiers. They were specialists in human logistics.
They had guard expertise.
Yes, their entire job was to maintain the value of the inventory. They had to calculate precisely how much food and water to provide.
And the calculation was?
Enough to prevent death, never enough for strength. They understood the cruel efficiency of keeping the cargo weak but alive.
And they were masters of applied psychology, too, using hope and desperation as management tools.
Indeed. They might offer marginally better treatment, a small extra ration, a slightly less painful shackle position, to anyone who cooperated fully.
Which would, of course, turn captives against each other.
It transformed the natural human desire for survival into a mechanism of control. It subtly encouraged informants and discouraged any kind of collective resistance.
And the march itself was planned. The routes were carefully mapped from the battlefields to the ports.
With identified way stations along the path. But these weren't humanitarian stops for rest. They were maintenance checkpoints.
Maintenance checkpoints.
Places where the guards could redistribute rations, check the security of the chains, and, critically, reassert control through public displays of power. Terror wasn't a spontaneous outburst, it was policy.
So how did they implement this policy of terror to ensure compliance among these large groups of traumatized people?
Well, any escape attempt or act of defiance was met with a public punishment designed to break the spirits of everyone else watching.
The accounts are graphic.
They are. This included things like burning with hot irons, a highly visible, incredibly painful deterrent, or, in the most severe cases, forcing everyone to witness torture. Or even crucifixion along the roadside, just left there as a warning.
Crucifixion, that's a Roman tactic.
It shows that the Vikings were students of terror. They adopted the most effective methods of systematic, institutional horror they encountered on their travels. Nothing was off the table if it worked.
And this systematic psychological breakdown, it continued beyond just physical torture. The sources point out the deliberate separation of women who spoke the same language.
This was a core strategy. Sisters, mothers, friends from the same village, they were all split apart and dispersed among unrelated groups.
Because shared language means shared comfort.
Shared comfort, shared planning, and shared resistance. Isolation was paramount. By leaving them linguistically and emotionally adrift, the slavers ensured the captives remained utterly dependent on them for all communication and direction. So after they endured this horrific march, the women finally reached the ports, and then they faced the next stage, the sea journey, the longships, which are described as floating prisons. And you have to remember the design of these ships. They were built for cargo and speed, not for human comfort.
So how did they adapt them for human freight?
With brutal simplicity. They installed wooden partitions down in the hold to create these cramped holding areas, basically slave pens. Women were packed in so tightly they often couldn't even lie down.
So they were forced to remain seated or crouched for weeks.
For the entire journey. I mean, can you imagine the conditions? Minimal ventilation, non-existent privacy, and just the pervasive stench of human waste, vomit, and fear.
It would have been a breeding ground for disease.
Absolutely. And the crews on these ships were specialized. They were rigorously trained for this specific type of human cargo with an intense focus on loss prevention.
What did that entail? Suicides were a constant risk, especially among those just beginning to realize their ultimate fate. The crews had specific procedures to identify and prevent them, using painful restraints or continuous monitoring. They were constantly making an economic calculation. How much suffering can we inflict without damaging the merchandise beyond repair? And that cold calculation extended to food and water as well, I imagine. The sources say rations were distributed based on market value.
Precisely. It was not egalitarian suffering. A beautiful young woman destined for a high-end market in the Arab world would get marginally better rations to preserve her appearance.
While an older woman destined for field labor would get the bare minimum.
The bare minimum to keep her heart beating. Pregnant women received just enough to preserve the unborn child, which was considered future property, a long-term investment.
And the sick, or those who were injured in a storm.
If their sickness posed a risk to more valuable cargo, they were often thrown overboard immediately. It was a purely clinical business decision, a cost-benefit analysis where the cost of slowing the ship or risking the entire cargo outweighed the value of that one person. Broken bones, internal injuries from storms, all of it was recorded simply as acceptable losses.
Factored into the expedition's projected profitability.
Just another line item in the ledger. This brings us out of the horrors of transport and into the destination, the slave markets. And this is where the institutional nature of this atrocity really comes into sharp focus. This is crucial for understanding Viking society. This moves from organized crime to what you could call the legitimacy of the trade.
Their slave markets weren't hidden back alley operations.
Not at all. They were legitimate businesses. They were regulated by law, taxed by authorities, and socially blessed. The paperwork, the taxation, the legal framework, it all conferred a kind of respectability onto an atrocity. It allowed the wealthiest, most powerful people to participate openly.
And the sources single out Dublin as the epicenter of this commerce, at least in the Western Viking world.
Yeah, Dublin was the biggest slave market in this part of the world. It occupied prime real estate right near the harbor, allowing ships to unload their human cargo directly into the market infrastructure.
And this infrastructure was permanent. It had to be. The city developed highly specialized permanent structures. Massive holding pens, private examination rooms for serious buyers, and elevated display platforms for auctions.
Right.
This investment in infrastructure proves the trade wasn't just opportunistic. It was the foundation of the city's prosperity. Dublin became the main clearinghouse for captives taken from England, Wales, and Ireland before they were shipped onto other markets, and the buyers were global. This shows the incredible reach of the Viking trading network.
The demand spanned continents. You had Irish nobles buying domestic servants. You had Norse merchants looking specifically for breeding stock to replenish their own thrall populations back in Scandinavia.
And you had Arab traders representing distant caliphates.
Exactly. From Baghdad, from the markets in Al-Andalus in Spain, the Vikings essentially connected the human supply of Northern and Western Europe to the global demand of the known world at that time.
That international dimension must have required some serious market intelligence. It would dictate who was taken and how they were treated.
Absolutely. The selection process back on the battlefield was informed by this global demand. Anglo-Saxon women might command a higher price because of a reputation for weaving skills or, surprisingly often, literacy.
And Slavic captives.
They were known as the Sakalaba in the Arabic world. They were prized for their hardiness in agricultural settings. So Viking slavers would adapt their merchandise selection based on the expected route and the final market, all to maximize profit. So let's talk about the moment of the transaction, the auction block and valuation. The scene described is just. It's women standing on wooden platforms being examined like horses at auction. And the examination was thorough and dehumanizing. Merchants would test muscle tone, check for any underlying health issues, and they'd question the seller about specific skills weaving, cooking, childbearing potential.
And the auctioneer's role wasn't just to facilitate the sale.
No, their job was to enhance the commercial appeal. They were master salesmen.
The sales techniques themselves reveal the depths of the commodification.
They were masters of presentation. Women were cleaned, groomed, and dressed in specific clothing to maximize their appeal. They'd even make efforts to conceal scars or signs of trauma-disguising defects in the product.
And the sources mention pregnant women being presented as 2-for-1 opportunities.
It showcases the economic mindset perfectly. The unborn child was already a guaranteed return on investment, a future slave born into bondage.
And the money involved. It must have been immense to justify the risk and the huge logistical investment.
The prices could be astronomical. They drove intense bidding wars that sometimes lasted for hours. A single, high-quality female thrall, young, fertile, skilled, could be sold for the equivalent wealth of a small farm.
Or several years' wages for a common free man.
Right. These high-value sales generated the capital that subsidized the entire operation. It covered the losses from transport and paid for the less valuable captives.
It sounds like beauty was a major factor, but specific skills were maybe even more valuable in the long run.
Skill was often the difference between life and death, or at least the difference between different kinds of hell. Literacy, knowledge of herbal medicine, advanced domestic skills like fine weaving or skilled cooking, all of it commanded premium prices.
And the sources suggest that having cooking expertise could mean the difference between luxury slavery.
Meaning domestic work inside a wealthy household.
And brutal field labor.
It's a tragic stratification of suffering, all based on a cold economic calculation of their utility.
So now we move past the transaction and into the daily reality of life under bondage. This is the systematic degradation that the sources repeatedly call worse than death. The most beautiful captives, the ones who fetched the highest prices, often faced a destiny that, on the surface, seemed less physically brutal serving in the great halls of Viking lords. But the sources say this was rooted in a unique form of systematic psychological torment.
This was what's described as the cruelest destiny. If physical brutality defined the march and the market, then psychological erasure defined their lives in the hall.
And the identity destruction began immediately upon arrival.
The very first day. A captured woman was instantly stripped of her original name. She was assigned a new Norse name, one that often reflected her status as property, and she was often forcefully stripped of her Christian faith.
That religious conversion aspect must have been deeply isolating.
It was intensely strategic. Forced conversion to the Norse pantheon under constant threat of violence did two things. It eliminated a source of her own psychological comfort, and it severed ties to her former culture, making her spiritually alien from any potential rescuer.
Her original identity, her heritage, her faith, all systematically destroyed.
She became a function, a tool for pleasure, a vessel for heirs, and most visibly a symbol of her captor's power. They were described as living ornaments.
Clothed richly, perhaps, but only as a display of the master's ability to subdue and possess foreign nobility.
And their entire existence was defined by hypervigilance and fear. Their survival hinged entirely on reading their master's most subtle signals. They had no rights, no recourse. A master's passing mood determined if they ate that day.
If they were beaten, or if they were subject to public humiliation.
All of which was designed to keep the other thralls in the household in a constant state of terror.
The psychological manipulation employed by the master sounds incredibly sophisticated. The sources describe this alternating pattern of cruelty and then unexpected kindness.
We recognize this now as a deliberate form of brainwashing. It's called traumatic bonding. The master would inflict severe cruelty, followed by a small, unexpected act of gentleness, a single piece of decent food, a moment of relief from a task.
And that fleeting kindness would be overwhelming.
It would overwhelm the captive with a sense of gratitude, momentarily clouding the reality that the master was also the source of all their torment. This emotional confusion made long-term resistance almost impossible and guaranteed a deep psychological dependency.
And of course, the sexual exploitation was systematic. It was inherent to their status as property.
It was an absolute expectation that permeated the entire system. Pregnancy offered no protection. In fact, it just confirmed a woman's usefulness as breeding stock.
The profound horror for these women must have been giving birth only to watch their own children automatically become the property of the same man who destroyed their lives.
And the masters kept detailed records. They treated their female thralls exactly like livestock, breeding them for future generations of bondage.
The sources specifically draw attention to the targeted degradation of the elite, the wives of commanders, chieftains, nobles. Why were these high-status captives treated with a specific, amplified form of cruelty?
Their humiliation was intensely strategic and political. The spectacle of a powerful man's wife being reduced to property sent a clear, powerful message to the entire defeated community.
What was that message?
Your honor, your status, your lineage, it means nothing to us. It was designed to break the morale of the surviving free population and to prevent any future thoughts of resistance.
So what specific techniques did these slavers use to break these aristocratic women who were, accustomed to commanding respect, not receiving orders?
The degradation was immediate and symbolic. They were instantly stripped of any fine clothes, jewelry, or family tokens. They were dressed in the roughest slave garments, and their hair was often cut short to physically mark them as property.
And then forced into the most menial tasks imaginable.
The most offensive tasks: scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, serving the common soldiers who may have killed their husbands. The shock of this total reversal of status was designed to crush their spirit as quickly as possible.
And the psychological agony for these elite women must have been amplified by their political awareness.
Absolutely. Unlike, say, an uneducated peasant woman, these noble women understood the political implications of their suffering. They knew exactly how their captivity would affect their husband's status, their family's power, and the entire political vacuum back home.
And the captors exploited that knowledge.
They used it as another layer of pain. And this is where the coerced propaganda comes in.
Right, using their own education against them.
It's perhaps the most sadistic element of the entire system. Some of these educated noble women were forced to write letters back to their families.
Not letters of comfort, I'm guessing.
No. Detailed, painful descriptions of their captivity, urging their kinsmen to surrender immediately or face the same fate. These letters became propaganda tools, spreading terror more effectively and more cheaply than deploying another army.
The sources also describe sadistic performances they were made to perform for their captors' entertainment.
These were public rituals of destruction. They were forced to auction off any of their remaining possessions, to publicly renounce their family titles, and even, under duress, to declare gratitude for their new slave status to their masters.
And these performances were shared.
They were sometimes recorded or recounted across the Viking network as a form of entertainment. It confirmed and celebrated their power to so thoroughly destroy a person's dignity.
Which brings us to the formal legal structure that institutionalized this entire business. The earliest Scandinavian legal texts, they're unflinching. They treat enslaved women as property, no different from livestock or weapons.
This wasn't just custom, this was the law and the bureaucracy of horror.
A master had absolute rights to beat, sell, or even kill his thralls without any legal consequence for the enslaved person.
What's truly fascinating is that these weren't primitive customs. These were detailed, sophisticated legal codes governing a massive commercial industry.
They demonstrate a really high level of organizational capability.
I do. These codes explicitly defined property rights in humans. Slaves could be used as collateral for major loans. They could be included in dowries, bequeathed in wills like any other high-value asset.
And the law about children.
Crucially, the legal status of the child automatically followed that of the mother's owner. That's the component that ensures multi-generational bondage. It's a self-perpetuating system.
You mentioned quality standards for trading. How did Viking law handle something like a warranty on a human being?
The laws were meticulous about disclosure, mainly to prevent disputes that could slow down trade. Merchants were legally obligated to disclose known defects.
Defects in a person.
Yes. If a thrall had a runaway tendency, a serious chronic illness, or was known to be rebellious, if the seller failed to disclose a major known defect, the buyer actually had limited return rights.
That's market regulation applied to human beings.
Prioritizing commercial reliability above all else. And the bureaucracy of it was as complex as any other major commercial enterprise.
So courts were regularly hearing cases about this.
They were. Court records contain cases involving property boundaries, disputes over ownership transfers after a death or a marriage, and damage claims if a slave was injured by a neighbor's animal, for example.
This constant legal affirmation just cemented the social consensus that enslavement was a legitimate, regulated business.
And the entire free population was legally complicit in maintaining the system.
How so?
The penalties for aiding a runaway were severe and widely enforced. Heavy fines, loss of your own property, or even being enslaved yourself. This eliminated any possibility of widespread public help for escapees, creating a legal and social infrastructure where every free person was responsible for upholding the system of bondage.
And if we connect this legal structure to the sheer numbers, the scale and economic impact is just staggering.
The archaeology confirms it. The iron shackles we find from Dublin all the way to Hedeby, they weren't improvised. They were manufactured goods for mass trafficking.
Standardized. We see different designs. Light, quick-release shackles for transport, and then heavier permanent collars for domestic or agricultural bondage. This standardization proves an industrialized system designed for consistent, high-volume human traffic. And the infrastructure at the major trading centers backs this up.
Yes. Excavations at Birka in Sweden have revealed specialized buildings reinforced, minimal windows, heavy doors, designed specifically for housing large populations of captives. In Hedeby, we find specialized loading areas near the waterfront with permanent iron rings set into the ground for chaining human cargo.
And what do the historical sources suggest about the raw scale of this? How many people are we talking about?
The numbers are huge. Historical sources suggest that at its peak, maybe up to 25% of the Scandinavian population itself was made up of enslaved individuals.
A quarter of the population.
And overwhelmingly women captured during foreign raids. We are talking about demographic shifts on an enormous scale.
These weren't small, opportunistic strikes. The raid on Seville in 844 CE.
That one raid alone is reported to have netted thousands of captives. The famous attack on Paris in 845 resulted in massive numbers of prisoners taken for sale. These were regular, major commercial expeditions designed to harvest human beings.
And the brutal mathematics must have confirmed the profitability, even accounting for the horrific losses during the journey.
Exactly. Even if half of the original captives died during the march or the sea voyage, which was a real possibility, the astronomical prices commanded by the survivors made the entire expedition enormously profitable.
Slave trading was the key economic driver.
It generated the capital needed to fund Viking expansion, to build their magnificent halls and ships, and ultimately to define their social hierarchies. This systematic human trafficking was, quite literally, the engine that built their kingdoms.
And the long-term trauma and legacy are still visible today.
They are. Target regions that were heavily raided showed significant demographic alteration for generations. Young women simply disappeared from the local population, leading to severe gender imbalances that altered reproductive capacity and social structures for decades.
And the psychological warfare, it continued even after the raid ceased. That deliberate targeting of the wives and daughters of local leaders was designed to spread terror.
The psychological destruction of families was paramount. Raider accounts even detail forcing husbands and fathers to make impossible choices, which family member to protect, which one to abandon, breaking families emotionally before the physical separation even began.
So the reputation for this overwhelming cruelty became a weapon in itself.
It was a strategic asset. Many settlements, aware of the fate that awaited their women and children, surrendered without a fight. They desperately hoped that cooperation might lead to marginally better treatment.
Which it often didn't.
The unpredictability of the treatment was part of the strategy that kept everyone off balance. And finally, there's the genetic impact. Modern DNA analysis reveals the extent of population mixing from this forced movement of women from Western Europe into Scandinavia and beyond.
It's a scientific confirmation of historical trauma.
It is. The descendants carry genetic markers that tell the silent story of their suffering and forced migration. The Vikings transformed warfare from temporary violence into permanent, generational exploitation. They built a system where systematic cruelty is disguised as economic progress. The true documented horror wasn't the capture. It was the meticulous system of degradation that followed, codified by law and celebrated by commerce.
This has been an intense but profoundly necessary deep dive. We've moved decisively past the myth of the noble Viking to confront the reality of a sophisticated, documented, and legally sanctioned industry built on industrialized human trafficking. To summarize the critical findings, the trade was comprehensive, meticulously documented with ledgers and pricing codes, and legally sanctioned by detailed property laws. The institutional horror involved complete identity, erasure new names, forced religious conversions, and the calculated commodification of human life through breeding programs and skills-based pricing ledgers. And the most telling, maybe the most difficult realization, is that the Vikings recorded everything. Every transaction, every price, every method of control was documented. This bureaucratic paper trail reflects a society that was proud of its efficiency, proud of its wealth generation, not ashamed of the brutality that underpinned it.
And the historical records confirm that the system only began to diminish not through some moral awakening, but because of economic and political changes that made other forms of exploitation, like tax peasantry or mercantilism, more profitable.
So the machine only stopped running when it ceased to be the most efficient way to generate capital.
That's what the evidence suggests, which raises an important final question for you, the learner, to mull over and explore on your own. If a civilization's immense prosperity and its lasting legacy are fundamentally built on documented industrial-scale cruelty, as evidenced by the meticulous records of the thralls, what does that documentation tell us about the human cost of progress? And how do we ensure we look beyond the glory of history to acknowledge the silent testimony of the millions of thralls who were erased by the very system that defined the age? Their voices may have been silenced by their captors, but their stories, preserved in the cold, hard facts of the archaeological record and the fragments of legal texts, demand that we remember the truth.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the true economic cost of Viking expansion. We'll see you next time.